Welcome to Relevant Revitalization, where you will find out the good, bad, and ugly of church revitalization. You will hear from pastors who have been through the revitalization experience, experts in the field, and much more, all with the goal of equipping, encouraging, and engaging you, your leadership, and your congregation to see God-breathed life in your church. Now, let's get into some relevant revitalization.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Relevant Revitalization. I'm Matt Coyne. Today, it is great to have back Mark Devries, founder of Ministry Architects, author of many books, and also learned the last time that Mark was on, also your how do you say that again? The ministry, what's the other?
Ministry Incubators.
That's it.
Yeah,
it's funny.
There's that.
Yeah, so, and I feel bad calling it Ministry Collab. I don't know why I said that. But anyways, so part of that as well, becoming a friend of the show. So I appreciate you coming back. But Mark, how are you doing today?
Great. I'm excited to be back. Excited about our topic today.
Good. Me too. It's crazy. This will be, we had 18 episodes last season and we did not talk about this topic one time. And so before we introduce the topic, Mark, I know you've been on before, but for new listeners, would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit more, your ministry experience, family, hobbies, all that fun stuff?
Sure. Well, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and have 3 babies and 4 grandbabies, 2 grand dogs. Well, actually 5 grand dogs. They just keep multiplying.
That's how that seems to happen.
And a grand lizard and a grand turtle.
Oh,
a lot going on.
That is, yeah.
A lot going on. Most of my sort of full-time ministry was in youth ministry, and so I got to serve in a single church for most of that time. So most of the 35 years of youth ministry was in Nashville at First Presbyterian Church here, and so I wrapped that up in 2014. So it's been 10 years since I've had a real job. Since that time, my work is really focused in these 3 areas: Ministry Architects, which is kind of a straightforward consulting company. So churches, nonprofits, schools, sort of regional judicatory sort of groups. And we tend to say in Ministry Architects, we do everything but capital campaigns and music programs. So searches, strategic planning, executive coaching, wherever a church might feel stuck, Ministry Architects kind of steps in. We also, as a part of Ministry Architects, I don't know if we were doing this, Matt, when we talked last, but we have a new sort of ministry called Ministry Admins, which is like a virtual assistant.
No, I don't think that was happening then.
So, most churches, historically have had like a receptionist or a secretary who may have been hired 30 years ago to file and answer the phones. And the need for admin support is really different now. And so things like graphic design and social media and preparing bulletins, preparing newsletters, designing PowerPoints for worship. So I have actually had a ministry admin for the last 3 or 4 years, and she's the one you've been dealing with to set all this up. And let me tell you, it is, as we talk about our topic today, that's not a bad resource we all think about. I hadn't thought about the connection.
Yeah, what a unique, that's cool.
So Ministry Architects is about a third of my time. The second third is Ministry Incubators, which is really more toward the outside the box stuff. It's, social enterprises. Typically, not always, but typically it has an alternate economic engine besides the traditional passing of the plate. So there's a revenue stream that's not waiting for donations. And then the other third of my time is around sort of a wide variety of missional projects. I've got a little nonprofit that we created about 10 years ago called Justice Industries that creates businesses to employ people with barriers to traditional employment. So you think about the people on the street corner, we just figure the greatest thing we can give them is not $10, but a job.
Yeah.
And so Justice Industries spent a good bit of time on that. And then also I'm my other sort of heart center is around working with Spanish speaking communities. So we have two sort of fledgling little Spanish speaking churches. And I'm 864 days into Duolingo in a row. I'm really working heavy on my Spanish. So those are my, I'm now, Matt, I'm 66. So I've crested the hill into Medicare. So it's a different sort of season. Ministry Architects, I now work for my son-in-law who now runs Ministry Architects. I'm a consultant, but I'm not in charge anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those are I have one wife, and I think those are my identity points.
Yeah.
Like
so today's topic, and it's funny, everyone's listening like, well, what is it? So I will say that you are definitely not a burned out. You've never been burned out in your ministry. You are always, I'm sure, fresh and spry and never in those seasons. So
no experience with that.
Yeah. But yeah, I love just the array of ministries that you have. And as you talk through, I definitely encourage anyone to go visit, Ministry Architects. And actually, for Ministry Architects, tell me if I'm wrong, you can get to your other ministries as well through there, correct? Like if they click on you or am I wrong saying that?
It's questionable.
Okay.
There may be hyperlinks in my bio, but I doubt it.
Okay.
So they're sort of separate entities.
Okay.
But if anybody desires to reach out to me, my cell phone number is 615-424-2304. And you just
there you go.
A text and I'll tell you how to find it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, and I know Ministry Incubators. I've visited that. I've sent that to a few people. And so, yes, those are the two that I've seen. And then obviously just your youth ministry impact for me over the years. And one of the most impressive things about you is the 30 plus years at one church in youth ministry. That might be a one of a kind, if not very rare. So all of that said, today's topic is burnout. And, I want to introduce this topic a little bit that in our first season, we didn't talk about this at all. And I was joking with Mark before we came on. I'm going to ask him a softball question. Has he ever been burned out? And that's just a silly question to ask anybody in ministry. But I read an article years ago from Mark that he did talk about burnout. And I could not find it for the life of me. I was looking everywhere for it, trying to find it. Couldn't find it, but I know I read it. But I wanted to talk about that because I know obviously this is within the revitalization, realm of things. And I can say firsthand, going through the revitalization journey with churches, there's a lot of burnout. And I think, unfortunately, what happens when a pastor is going, oh no, I'm burned out, it's too late. It's not too late as far as, oh no, there's no coming back, but it's too late as far as many times helping to get through that. So that's what I want to talk about. So first, Mark, my first question for you is, how do you define burnout? Because I think if you ask 10 different people, they might give you 10 different answers, but how do you define burnout in ministry?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I would put this in in Webster's dictionary, but my experience of burnout has been sort of a paralysis, an exhaustion. It smells a lot like sadness, or perhaps, anger turned in on itself, or or sometimes shame, like, oh, gee, I just wasn't able to pull this thing off. Um, but mostly it's I don't want to play anymore. Um, I just, um, can I just get off of this wild machine and maybe go sell shoes or something?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that's my, when I was when I was deep in, when I described my, most acute burnout, and you're right, I've had several. Um, you know, I just describe it, metaphorically, maybe not literally, as crawling up in the fetal position and sucking my thumb. I mean, just I just please don't give me another thing. Don't give me another problem to solve. Um, I just don't want to play anymore.
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and I like how you started with paralysis because there's a saying in our home that we say we're stress paralyzed, and
Yeah,
there's so much happening in our life that we're literally paralyzed because we don't even know where to turn.
yeah,
And so I like that you say that, and I like that you say I don't want to play anymore because that's the I know we this is a whole other discussion, but during the pandemic, I mean, I don't know how many of my friends I would talk to. They're like, "I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm going to go do something else."
hmm
And I mean, they're in their 30s, 40s, going, I can't do this anymore.
yeah.
And it was so sad to watch. And I can't even blame them, right? Like that's the thing. I can't even blame a pastor who gets to that point to say, you know, I can't take this anymore. So Mark, my next question for you is in your consulting experience, would you say burnout? I'm just going to throw arbitrary number. Would you say burnout is a top 3 issue, top 5 issue of pastors who are in need of consulting, they find their church in need of revitalization, they find their church on life support? What would you say to that?
Matt, it's interesting. Um, Typically, burned out pastors don't look for a consultant.
Mm,
They're just looking for the exit.
wow.
Um,
Yeah.
they're not. It just takes too much work to think about selling the idea of a consultant to your leadership board, and I don't want to do that. I'll just write my sermon every week and try to keep my head down and do my job. Um, Yeah, so I do think you have to have a certain level of buoyancy or resilience uh, that you bring to the table to have the courage to to bring in a coach or a consultant.
Yeah.
A lot of times people, it's sort of like therapy. I mean, you think, oh, the only people that go to therapy are people that have problems. Well, since 100% of us have problems, I think that qualifies us pretty well.
Yeah.
But there's some shame that goes along with it. And I often, thinking back to the Olympics a couple weeks ago, I often think it's only the champions, it's only the Olympians that need a coach. The I don't need a coach to help me run a 13-minute mile, right? That's not in the. I don't care. I'm gonna try to stay all the things, right?
Mm,
Um, but if you're gonna stay in the game for a long time, the folks that I have seen that have stayed in the game, they get a coach. In fact, I think we may have talked about this last time. They get a constellation of coaches. So they might have a therapist and a spiritual director. They might have a ministry coach. They might have a financial coach, a marriage coach, a parenting coach. This whole constellation of people that help, they stand on the shoulders of these coaches and kind of get better and better and increase their capacity. But there's such fear around that, and by the time you get to burnout, yeah, most uh, most people are not looking for a coach; they're just looking for the exit.
yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I guess, I think of, a church who's in need. And again, that's a whole other, wow, we could go all day here. A church that's even in burnout. I have seen churches who I would consider the congregation is in burnout as far as that paralysis, like you said. We don't know where to turn. We don't know what to do. And we're just burned out trying to figure that out. But again, that's a whole other discussion.
Going back, Matt, to our previous definition, they don't want to play anymore.
Mm,
And creativity and innovation and revitalization all require a level of playfulness. They require a level of buoyancy.
yeah.
And when you're burned out, you don't want to play. And let's use that term play very deliberately.
Yeah.
Jesus said, if you want to get in the kingdom of heaven, you come like a child, and children know how to
That's
play.
good.
But by the time they reach this point, they're just like hanging on by their fingernails. Maybe I'll die before the church does and I can have my funeral here.
Yeah.
But the level of thinking beyond the present and just survival, um, they just don't have a wide enough aperture to see that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's good. Yeah. So that idea of, I really like that you say that, a pastor in burnout isn't going to really look for a consultant because they're just so burned out. And I guess that is what another beautiful reminder of trying to help. And we're going to get to this, of helping us see signs as pastors. What are those signs of burnout? How can we help ourselves not get into that season? But again, we'll get to that. Before we do, Mark, again, easy question for you, but I would love if you'd be willing to be vulnerable and open with us. Can you tell us a time in your own ministry that you were burned out and what that looked like? And again, just what you'd be willing to share with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there have been several. And, the one that's the most, that feels the most acute, was when I was writing family-based youth ministry, or family-based youth ministry had just come out. And, you know, like we all do, I was strong on theory and not great on implementation.
Mm,
And so, uh, I basically what I said was, what we know leads to long-term faith maturity is what happens in the home, and building an extended family around young people so that they have a great cloud of witnesses that supports them, gives a culture in which they grow up into faith. And I was trying to make the argument that this sort of age bifurcation, where we pull a particular segment out of the church so we can disciple them, is like pulling a heart out and trying to work on the heart and thinking the body's going to stay alive and the heart's going to stay alive. Just doesn't work. And so I was really trying to speak to, we got to do this thing together as the total body of Christ, all the generations together, right? So, I felt pretty passionate about that. And so the first thing I did was to cancel youth group, in favor of, we still had Sunday morning. So that was an age segregated program, but I canceled youth group and did some other, what I thought were wildly creative things. Um, and that became a real sort of, firestorm.
mm,
And this was the church I was at for almost 30 years. And, there were all kind of, it sort of came to a head, where we had a youth committee meeting, and we were going to talk about, this whole, it'd been 6 months in, we were doing okay, and weren't having Sunday night programs anymore. And I came to the youth committee meeting. Instead of the normal 6 or 7 people on the youth committee, there were like 30 or 40 parents there.
oh,
Surprise. And it was like for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, I describe it as rotisserie Devries. They just roasted me for 2.5 hours. And that was a low point. And my senior pastor was not terribly supportive during this time. And perhaps for good reason, because, I didn't roll this thing out in the gentlest way.
okay.
I could have, instead of betting the farm, I could have tried some things more incrementally, but be that as it may, I, you know, but those 6 months were really hard. Um, I felt like I was in trouble all the time.
Yeah.
I was trying to convince people, all the things. And so the next day, um, one of the fathers, one of the dads that was at that meeting, called me, and I was a little hesitant to answer the phone. I think I was looking at the one ads to see if I could get a job selling cars somewhere. And he called me and said, I thought he was just going to pile on a little bit more. And he said, I realized that I got invited to that meeting and you didn't know we were coming. And I got set up to beat you up. And I don't like to be treated that way. And I'm sure you didn't enjoy that. And I just want you to know I'm available for you if you need my help. He's a very successful businessman, and he sort of, actually dedicated sustainable youth ministry to Jim and his wife. But that year, seriously, I was thinking I could sell some cars, y'all.
Yeah.
I'd be a great, I'm honest. I got some relational skills. I'll help people find what they want. I could really sell some cars. Maybe sell shoes. I was looking anywhere. I looked at selling insurance. I did an application to sell. So many things.
I'd buy something off you, Mark.
Would you? Would
yes.
you? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, and during that time, it was so intense. That was 1992. Fast forward about almost 10 years. And I'm back in the same sort. I'm not, the church is happy. Things are going fine. We got a great staff. Things are working, but I have just lost my heart for this thing. And I go to see a spiritual director, and I had, I'd seen him for several years. And I just remember, every time I went to see him, it was just sort of this desperation of help me, get me out of this. I gotta get out of this. I'm so exhausted. I don't want to play anymore. And so that was 2001, 2002. And we did a thing called a Quaker Clearness Committee. Are you familiar with this?
No.
This is kind of obviously a Quaker thing. Parker Palmer sort of popularized it. But basically, my spiritual director led us through, and he said, you got to get 3 people who have no agenda in your life. So it can't be a coworker, it can't be a family member. And you sit in a room with these 3 people, and all they can do is ask questions for 3 hours.
Wow.
And so we did this thing. And by the time it was over, it was just wildly clear that I needed to leave. I needed to stop. This was 13, 14 years into my work at First Pres. And so, I had to walk through a process, but ultimately decided, if I leave here, I had written family-based youth ministry by that time, and I was under the crazy illusion that anybody cared and that somebody would want to hear me talk or would hire me to do something because of family-based youth ministry. Yeah, not so much. So, but what I thought was I'll get a part-time youth ministry job in Tampa or someplace, and then I'll do something else on the side. And then somebody said, well, if you're going to get a part-time youth ministry job, why don't you just stay here? Where I already had 14 years of relationships. So 2.5 generations of kids.
Yeah.
And sure enough, that's what happened. The church was gracious enough to let me stay in a part-time capacity. And we brought on some additional staff. And that was about the time Ministry Architects came into being. But those experiences, while, I look back and say, oh, what beautiful moments of grace there were. I had somebody called and said, do you do consulting? And I said, you better believe it. if they'd asked, do I do nuclear physics? I said, yeah, I'll do whatever. I do anything for a buck. I was selling my blood. I mean, we were in a pretty rough position financially. And so looking back, I think, oh, look at all those beautiful moments of grace, but also they were just sort of life sucking. I just didn't have the gas. I didn't want to play anymore.
Yeah.
Then the final one came in 2013, 2014. I was going to go on my 200th or so mission trip. And I started getting a queasy feeling in my stomach. And I realized that's not the first time that's happened. And I know how profound and valuable those trips are with kids. Yeah. But I just realized I can't keep doing this.
Yeah.
So interesting, Jesus said the thing about unless a seed falls to the ground and dies. Every one of my burnouts was a seed for something new God was birthing, but it sure felt like a crusty old nasty seed breaking apart in the dirt, not doing anything and just being dead.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was a long answer to a very short.
No, I appreciate you being so open and vulnerable. And what I love is you ended it with something I think we forget. Burnout's not fun. But so often, if we're just being faithful to our call, it'll lead to something new. It'll lead to, I have a friend who's going through that burnout right now, and the church is being pruned in a pretty painful way. And I reminded him, I said, well, pruning isn't fun. I said, pruning's never fun. I said, but so there's these seasons. So I like that you said the burnouts led to something that God was doing. Yeah. And praise God. And I'm thankful for you that you said, I'm going to tough this out and see what it is, but it's still not a fun season. Let's be honest. It's not, I'm sure you would say, I'd love to go back and not have to deal with that and still have God show me what he was doing. And then one of the other things I noticed from your answer is sometimes burnout hits without any notice. It seems like that first one in 92 that you thought you were doing something great, and that burnout kind of just hit you like a 2x4, maybe a Mack truck, probably more like a Mack truck.
Yeah.
But that said, Mark, can you give us some advice on some signs of burnout? Again, sometimes we don't see it coming, but can you give us some signs? I know you said we don't want to play anymore, but I feel like that's the outcome of signs that we could have maybe seen coming. So are there any signs you can give us?
Yeah, let's kind of reframe it. The desert is not our enemy. The wilderness is not our enemy. The dark night and the loneliness and the sadness is not our enemy. Jesus was very intentional about being in the desert, and Paul was very intentional about being in the desert, and the monastics were very intentional about being in that. So, especially in a time when the church is as fragile as it is right now, we sort of think if we can just prop up this institution and help this institution be a little more, have better infrastructure and be a little stronger. But what if it's not about building better temples, but having a season when we're in tabernacles? What if we're on the way somewhere and that way leads through the desert? And that we got some stories about that in the Bible.
Yeah.
And one of the, borrowing from a book I'm loving right now called Picking Up the Pieces. And basically what they say is, what if it's about instances of church rather than institutions of church? Kind of think about the Camino de Santiago. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but when we go on pilgrimage, people come in for a minute or a week. They're on the trail together and then they go apart. So there is a sort of a recognizing God's presence, even when it feels like all the props, all the structures have sort of fallen away. So back to your question, which I totally distracted from, which
No, no.
remind me your question again, because it's a really fun time.
No, that was good. My question was, can you
The
give us some
sign.
signs? Yeah, some
Okay,
signs of
yeah.
burnout.
So that was the precursor to yes, but when it comes, it could be that the spirit is showing up in a really profound way in the desert, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk about my own signs of burnout. Sort of nothing tastes good anymore.
Mm,
When somebody says, the fundamental spiritual question is, what do you want? God asking us, what do you want? And when the only answer we can give is, I just want to get out. I just want to rest. I just want to stop. That's all. I don't have any desires besides get me out of here. Right. That feels like a sign. Of course, you know, sometimes when God is holding up the mirror for us in the frail instrumentality of our spouses, um, and they say, you're kind of being a jerk.
yep.
We should take that seriously, right?
Yeah, that's a good sign.
Dad, why are you screaming at me all the time?
Yeah.
So that sort of short temper. Um, um, I'd also say if you haven't read a book in the last year, you're close. You're
Yeah.
headed to burnout. If you haven't learned something new in the last
Good
year,
point.
you're close. If you don't have any coaches, um, if you don't have friends, um, because you're trying to keep these really safe boundaries with the church, and I don't have any friends, and if you don't have friends, and pastors, something like 50% of pastors say they have zero friends. What? What? And we're supposed to be helping people build these flourishing lives relationally? Come on.
Yeah.
So intentionality around friendships, missing those bases. On the positive side, if you're having a couple 2-hour dinners with friends and family every week, you're probably going to have a nice inoculation against burnout.
Yeah. That's good.
If you have something you love, like if it's model trains or doing stand-up comedy or watching some ridiculous sitcom, whatever it is, but if there's something that you love, that's what happens with burnout, is that we move from this sort of dance to the grind, and we're just plodding. And the only way to get out, and we're not going to serious our way out of burnout. In other words, what I need to do is I need to work harder. I need to work harder to get out of burnout. I need to work. No, maybe you need to play more. Susan and I, we'll probably be dead before we do it, but we dream of writing a book called Stop Working on Your Marriage. Marriage is for play. And most marriages fall apart because they work so hard and there's not enough buoyancy or altitude. There's not enough fabric of the 1,000 meaningless conversations to hold the heaviness and the seriousness of solving the conflict. We're way off topic, but
No.
John Gottman, who's writes about marriage a lot, has the marriage lab in Washington State. He identified, this is 10, 15 years ago, identified that 64% of healthy marriages have at least one ongoing conflict that never gets solved. These are extraordinarily happy marriages, and they still have, but if we spend all our time trying to solve something that is never going to get solved, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
And so in ministry, we got to find, remember, Jesus said, if you want to get in, it is only through the little ball pit at McDonald's that you're actually ever going to get into the kingdom. If you can't stoop to the level of a child and be playful, the chances of you tasting sort of the sweetness of the kingdom is a little slim.
Yeah. I, I know you said you were getting off topic. You weren't. I mean, I think, I remember one of my seasons of Burnout when my wife texted me. I was at the church and she goes, "Hey, we need to talk." I'm like, "Uh-oh." I mean, and I went home and both of us in tears for 2-3 hours. She's like, "You're never here." And I was in burnout. So I was doing what you said we all do. I was trying to work myself out of it. I was trying to, there's a whole other story to that. But she said, when you're here, you're not here. You're always on your phone. You're always calling people, texting people. Your kids never see you anymore. And she's like, "I know we're a ministry family and we sacrifice a lot, but I think you're sacrificing too much. And I love you and I miss you. And I want us to," her exact words, I'll never forget. She goes, "I just want us to have fun again." And in tears, I'm like, "I'm so sorry." And I listened, and I'm thankful that I listened because I think a lot of people in that season will go, no, we can't have fun right now. That's not what this is about. I need to work. Yeah. And so I'm just thankful that you said that, because that is a huge sign. And, another one, I love that you keep saying to have fun, to play. I was in youth ministry for 13 years, a lead pastor now, but this last summer, we are so blessed. We have teenagers in our church. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do a mission trip, because I used to do those every year. I loved them. And so we had a mission trip, 27 people went on it. And my wife, before I left, she goes, "Now remember, you're not the youth pastor anymore. You can't be." Mark, it lasted 30 seconds and we're leaving that morning. And I turned it all back and I had so much fun. And I told our youth intern, I said, "You better believe I'm coming next year again." I said, "You can lead it," but I said, "I'm coming," because it was so much fun.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. If you lose that joy, I truly can say that most mornings I wake up and I'm excited. I always joke to say I have the best job in the world. I love what I do, but you better believe there are mornings that I'm like, ugh, the last thing I want to do is get up and do this. And I think if you have more and more of those days, you're finding yourself on the fast track to burnout.
Yeah, that's right.
So thank you I know, like I said, you said you went off topic, but you didn't. I think that's important reminders.
I live off.
Yes. Yeah, me too. Which is why I need to be in a manuscript when I preach, or I'll be all over the place. So another question for you. You've shared a lot about what we do when we're in that season of burnout, but is there anything else that you didn't really touch on that, okay, a pastor, they find themselves in burnout, they're in it, they maybe are listening right now going, uh-oh, I'm kind of checking the boxes off here. You've shared a lot, but is there anything else that's applicable that a pastor can maybe hear from you to get out of that season of burnout? With being careful, like you just said, I think that's okay. Those seasons aren't bad if we are being faithful to the Lord. What I mean is to remain faithful and to have that strength to get through it.
Yeah. Well, we're really talking about something that it's hard for us pastors to think about. We're talking about stewardship of ourselves. Like, Mary Oliver says, "What will we do with this one wild and precious life we've been given?" Yeah. And we have and typically we're happy to disappoint no one except ourselves. And then maybe by extension, our family. Right. And we have, so in this season, if you're in a season of burnout, do the check. We got to be investing in building a healthy ecology around ourselves. Just imagine we've been planted as a seed and we're breaking apart in the soil. We've fallen in the ground and we've died. And we want this. It's all about good soil. And, compost smells pretty bad, but it produces a great harvest. So you want to, to keep that metaphor going, you want to make sure the soil is really rich in terms of what's your exercise life like? What's your how you doing taking care of your food and your diet and all that sort of stuff? How you doing in your spiritual practices? Do you have meetings with mentors and friends? Are you, investing in time away? What about, do you have vacation time or, um, uh, continuing education time? But just doing sort of that 39 point diagnostic of, how are all those checkpoints, um, uh, what's happening with my constellation of coaches? Have I talked to a financial planner in the last year? What's my 401k look? All of those things. So to step apart from, oh gee, I'm going to try really hard to get out of this and people don't understand me and the churches and blah, blah, all that kind of, that sort of direct assault at burnout just never works.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
seldom works. What works is tending to the larger ecology of our lives. So all of those things, do you have a rhythm of a date night with your wife? Do you have once a month or so you're hanging out individually with each of your kids? How you doing with your parent? And are you learning something? Because for most pastors, they stopped learning a long time ago. Most Christians stopped learning a long time ago, and they just figure, I'm going to just hang on for dear life to try not to backslide. And the biggest way to keep from backsliding is to grow. So, whether it's going to see a spiritual director, taking an Enneagram course, there's so many, go to a monastery and take some time of silence. There's so many things, but I do think apart from the people we hang out with and the books we read, we're going to be stuck exactly where we are, except every year a smaller version of ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what
I love that you keep going back to learning. I have a mentor who told me, he said, Matt, the moment you stop being humble and teachable is the moment you need to leave ministry. And then he always adds, he's like, every Christian should be humble and teachable. But I used to hate to learn, not because I didn't like to learn, because I felt like I was an idiot. And I was always surrounded around people who were so much smarter than me. I'm like, so for me, I really focused hard on that. And that's what gets me excited, because then I get to implement that stuff I'm learning. And like you said, back in 92, sometimes we do things that we think is just brilliant and beyond anything anybody could ever imagine. And I'm like, oh, that fell flat on its face and I need to apologize. Right. But yeah, all that said, I appreciate, and I like that the check, the diagnostic, where are you when you're in that season? One thing that's near and dear to me is many of our listeners are part of this group too, called Practically Pastoring, which is a podcast. 5 pastors come together and to do this podcast. But one of the things they started doing 3 years ago was having a conference down in Tarpon Springs, Florida. And I've been blessed to know these guys outside of that as well. But it's just a group. 3 years ago, we had 25. That was it. It wasn't this large NYWC or TGC. 25 guys came together. There was no keynote speaker. It was all of us learning with one another, praying with one another, crying, laughing, having fun. We literally went shark fishing at 12 o'clock at midnight. It was just fun. And those guys I built such relationships with that when I do get into those seasons, there was a guy I heard one time, he goes, the best way to remain humble is to surround yourself with people who don't think much of you. And I'm like, I got plenty of that. So I appreciate that insight. And before you head out, I don't know if you remember, I asked you this last time. I asked this to everybody as they head out. Do you have any closing encouragement for pastors as they listen to this episode?
Well, we're in a really different season in the life of the church. Phyllis Tickle says every 500 years, the church has a yard sale.
Yep.
And we are in that time. And And, again, borrowing from this book, Picking Up the Pieces, it's all based on the life of Moses. And we are moving from a model of leadership that is the pyramid to a model of leadership that's the mosaic, where we are apart, but we don't have to be the smartest person in the room. And often pastors work really hard to only be in situations where they're the smartest person in the room. And so stepping out of the need to be at the pinnacle of the pyramid. Now, this is much more stable. This thing's not going to blow away.
Yeah.
But a circle is much more fluid, and you draw upon the gifts of each person in the group. So when you find an over-functioning pastor, you've got a church of under-functioning disciples, and those dance together because they are happy for the pastor to overfunction and for them to go do something else.
Yeah.
But there's no joy in that. The joy of discipleship is the joy of being in a missional community where we're working side by side together for the gospel. And most models of church, especially the more successful ones, are built on a high power person at the top and everybody else is a little helper. Yeah. And so giving up some of that control, the one who wants to be first among you will be last.
Amen.
It's that becoming a servant, taking on the towel. And we're happy to preach about that so we can be an expert about service more than anybody else in the room. But living that out is really hard. So I just want to say to, all your listeners, if it's hard, it's because it only makes sense that it would be hard right now. This is a weird and wacky time, and the church is in such a fragile place. And so bless you for just showing up and hanging in there. Oh, one other thing, Matt, I know we're well over time.
No, you're fine.
I do want to, and we can do this next year if you're still going. I do think being a full-time pastor is often a contributor to burnout. When I moved to my part-time role in ministry, I had so much more energy for ministry.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to kind of explore bivocational ministry with you at some point.
Let's do that. Yeah. I'd love that.
Because there are models emerging, and most churches can't afford a full-time pastor right now.
Yeah.
So I leave that with you.
No, and a lot of churches, that's a perfect topic for this, because a lot of churches who are in need of revitalization are there. They can't afford a full-time pastor, or pastors, they have to be bivocational because they can't afford, to not do that to provide for their family. So I'd love to have you back on and to talk about that next season, Lord willing. So
right.
Awesome. Well, Mark, again, as always, thank you for being part of this. I just love our two discussions we've had and getting to know you personally. And for those who are listening, just a reminder, this is more than a podcast. I want to be here, as Mark was saying, to walk alongside you. And I'm sure Mark would love that, to utilize his resources as one of those tools for that coaching as well. But reach out to me on social media, or, if you know myself, whatever that looks like, just reach out to me. At the very least, I'd love to be praying with you as you go through ministry. So again, Mark, thanks for being here. Thanks to our listeners. Until next time, this is Relevant Revitalization.